It is my great pleasure today to welcome one of our UCLA colleagues from just downstairs, Gabriel Rossman from the Sociology Department, and he will be talking on obfuscation of morally disreputable exchange.
Yeah.
Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thanks. Thanks. And because I'm from just downstairs, I figured there was no need to go through the whole half hour slot, because we've all been on the other end of that. We know how difficult it is to schedule, but I figured anybody who wants to meet me, just send me an email and we'll have coffee sometime. I'm right downstairs.
Well, we are having coffee after.
Yeah, there'll be the coffee after this, but I'm saying we didn't need to do the half hour, like I was a visitor. Like a visitor, you know? All right, so this is a project I've been working on for a while. It actually kind of came accidentally out of my radio book, where there's a chapter in my radio book on payola, or bribery, in pop music. And when I was collecting the data, I was really just trying to see which songs were involved in payola so I could do some statistics on them. And then in the course of that, reading these court documents, I noticed that there was all this gift exchange language. And so I thought back to grad school. I'm like, oh, I recognize this stuff. And so this kind of came out of that book. There's been 3 publications so far out of this project. There was a sociological theory paper. There was a Cato Unbound symposium that Alan Fisk participated in. And then most recently, there was a 2018 American Sociological Review. And these are basically theory, vignette experiments. And I'll go over the theory and the vignette experiments. And then the thing that I've yet to do, but I'm working on and would value feedback, advice, examples, anything like that for, is I want to write a book where go over all the evidence I'm going to present today, all the theory I'm going to present today, and then also I'm hoping to talk about kind of a broad overview of ethnographic and social history cases. All right, so the basic underlying issue is one of disreputable exchange, of what can be exchanged for what. In anthro, you might call it circuits of exchange. And so one type of exchange is that you can have market goods, such as money, exchanged for goods that we see as properly belonging in the sphere of the market, such as cell phones. And this is totally morally acceptable within our culture. Nobody would look twice if you were to tell them a story about, I went to the AT&T store yesterday and bought a cell phone and I paid cash for it. They wouldn't look at you astray. Likewise, you can exchange sacred goods for sacred goods, at least under some circumstances. So for instance, especially within the context of an ongoing relationship, it's acceptable to trade sexual favors for sexual favors. And again, if you were to, it might be considered impolite to talk about in public, but it's not considered immoral in of exchange if you were to tell me that you and your boyfriend had sex last weekend. I mean, it might be like, why are you telling me this? But I wouldn't think that the thing in of itself, that 2 members of a couple had exchanged sexual pleasure, would be disreputable. However, if you exchange a market good, such as money, for a non-market good, such as sexual favors, this is seen as morally disreputable. And it's seen as morally disreputable specifically because it's economics. I want to be clear here that I'm not talking about all exchanges that are considered morally disreputable. So for instance, if you were were pulled over and the cops searched your car and they found a balloon full of heroin and fentanyl, and you said, oh, it's okay, officer, I got that for a birthday present. The police would not be impressed that this heroin came as a birthday present, because the problem with heroin is heroin. It's not paying for heroin. Whereas on the other hand, if a police officer suspected you of engaging in an act of prostitution, and you said, oh, no, we're just dating, this is an ordinary relationship, that actually would get you off, right? That actually would be a valid excuse. If you were suspected of bribery, and you said, no, this is just constituent service, I'm just having a conversation with my congressman and saying that as a constituent, I would like this political favor, that would get you off if you could demonstrate that there was no compensation involved. So I'm really talking about the class of interactions where they are considered to be morally disreputable precisely because they are seen as exchanges, not because of something else involved. So the example I always use is that an assassination or hit job without payment is still murder, whereas prostitution without sex is just casual sex, right? And so there's a difference in the moral level of disreputability. There's a large body of things that fall under this. Was there a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, when you discuss this model, who is the are seen as? Who's the audience?
Yeah, audience is actually a big deal in this, in that, so to a certain extent, there's an internal audience where you could be judging yourself. You could be saying to yourself, am I the kind of person who would do this sketchy behavior? That I see myself as a more moral, honorable agent who would not engage in this type of behavior. And then there could also be an audience of the police, that you don't want to go to jail, you don't want to be arrested. And then there could also be an audience of just social stigma. So for instance, if I told you that last weekend I drove up to northern Nevada and went to a legal brothel and paid for sex at the legal brothel, I would not be confessing to a crime, because in that jurisdiction it would be legal. But I would be confessing to social stigma, because it's still socially stigmatized to pay for sex. Among most audiences, right? There's some audiences where they might say that sex work is work, blah, 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 all that sort of thing. Yeah. But among most audiences, that would be considered stigmatized. And to me, the big one is probably social stigma and kind of an internal sense of honor rather than the cops. Although they both play in. And it is interesting when you can see sometimes these things will go to court and a judge will say, well, this is just dating, or well, this is just campaign finance, and there are kind of formal legal audiences for some of these things. That's especially important in the case of Islamic finance, which we'll talk about in a bit. So examples of these things would be commercial bribery, such as my original motivating case of payola in the radio industry. If there's no payment involved, it's not payola, it's just record promotion. Political bribery, if there's no bribery involved, if there's no payment involved, it's not bribery, it's just lobbying. Simony, which is not a big deal in our culture, but was a huge problem in the Middle Ages. Perceived as a problem. It may still be that it happens or doesn't happen as much as it ever did, but it was a highly salient social problem in the Middle Ages. This is the issue of bribing members of the church. Riba, that's Islamic for usury, and this is a huge issue in Islamic finance, where the Quran says you can't engage in riba, and most Islamic scholars will tell you that riba has something to do with charging a fixed rate of interest on the principal, but it's very hard to say, well, what if you have something that looks like charging a fixed rate of interest on the principal, but in some narrow technical sense it's not, and depending on which Islamic scholars you talk to, they'll either say that's fine or it's not fine. Deaccessioning, museums are not supposed to sell works of art, and in fact it's in the museum director's code of ethics that if anyone ever sells a work of art that's been donated to their museum, that they're supposed to be ostracized by all other museum directors. It's like a formal ostracism, and in practice this means that if you ask to borrow something for a visiting show or something like that, they're not supposed to cooperate with you. Prostitution, of course, is the most obvious case of something that is morally disreputable precisely because it's economic. Human tissue markets, you can donate kidneys, you can't sell kidneys. This is not true necessarily of all human tissues. So you can fairly openly sell sperm, but there still can be certain rhetorics around it. In fact, UCLA got in trouble for selling human tissues. And the photo that I have on the right is a still from the Met's production of Le Conte de Hoffmann, and it's the scene where Coppelius is selling eyes to Spallanzani, and Hoffman's like, he's selling eyes, this is an outrage. That basically happened here at UCLA about 10 years ago, when, in 2004 actually, when somebody who was working for the medical school's cadaver program was going through a middleman to sell human tissues to various scientific labs. They actually were literally selling eyeballs. The price of a cornea was $400 on this market. And it caused kind of a scandal for UCLA's cadaver program. You also see baby selling. Adoption very often shades into baby selling. There's complicated practices that people can engage in to make it look like they're not engaging in baby selling, but if it costs $10,000, $20,000 to engage in an adoption, that money goes somewhere, right? And then you also see this with labor violations, where sometimes people find ways where there's people who they're not supposed to engage in a labor practice with, or there's a certain set of compensation or some other problem with labor that you're not supposed to engage in, but people find ways to hide it that's going on. So the solution the workaround or the loophole to this sort of thing is what I call obfuscation, which is when people find ways to hide that they are engaging in an exchange at all. And so the one party still gets the market good and the other party still gets the sacred good, but it's not immediately obvious that the market good is being commensurated with the sacred good. And there's a variety of ways that this can happen. But the interesting thing about it is that they transform the nature of the set of transfers and the interaction. And sometimes this is so well institutionalized that we even have names for the obfuscated version of the exchange. So for instance, through obfuscation, prostitution becomes transactional sex. Now, transactional sex is a term that's mostly used by scholars, but there's a everyday colloquial English word, sugar baby and sugar daddy, to refer to this economic institution. And there's kind of a widespread sense that sugar babyism has something in common with prostitution, but it's not as bad, right? It's like on the continuum, somewhere between dating and prostitution. And it makes sense because ordinary dating does involve gifts that go back and forth between the people who are dating. And it's very hard to say at what point does this go from an ordinary situation of, well, it's totally normal that your boyfriend would give you a Christmas gift or a birthday present or something like that, or take you out to dinner, to, well, at this point, this is basically prostitution. And it becomes fuzzy, and that's the whole point. Likewise, in Islamic finance, there's specific names to the workarounds that Islamic scholars have approved for getting around the interest taboo. Things like, let me check my notes because I am not an Islamic scholar, but tawarruk, which is basically delayed payment. So I buy something from you and I agree to pay 110% of the price a year from now instead of paying you 100% of the price today. And so we're basically combining a sale with a delayed payment. And most Islamic scholars would say that's fine, that it's different from, so if I sell you this laptop for $1,000, but you say, well, I'll pay you next year $1,100, most Islamic scholars would say that that's fine and it's qualitatively different than me loaning you $1,000 and you paying me back $1,000 with $100 interest. Like, it seems to an economist these are the same set of transactions, but to an Islamic scholar they're different. There's also something called bay-al-ina, which is sale and buy back, which is I sell you this laptop for $1,000 and then you immediately transfer back the laptop to me, but then you say that you'll pay me back in a year and you'll pay me back $1,100 in a year, right? So both cases you're effectively creating something that looks a lot like regular bank interest, but these things have names and they're approved by most Islamic scholars. Now, the whole point of obfuscation, though, is usually to make it so it's not obvious what you're doing and to try and conceal it in something else. So, political bribery can become campaign finance and lobbying, but it's very difficult to say at what point is something basically a bribe and not just, an ideological commitment to working with a politician or constituent service or some other honorable means of relationships between politicians and constituents. Likewise, with simony, there's this great passage in Volume 2, Question 100 of Summa Theologica, where, I don't know if you've never read Summa Theologica, it has this point-counterpoint rebuttal to the first point style, very similar to the California Voter Guide that you get in the mail, talk about the ballot initiatives. And, Aquinas basically says, well, simony's wrong. And he's like, yeah, but I know what you're going to say here. You're going to say, what about all these places in the Bible where somebody gets a religious service and then they pay for the religious service? And then he says, no, you don't understand. Those are all gifts. Like every single time in the Bible that it talks about somebody getting a religious service and then paying the person who gave them the religious service, that was really a donation. So that's okay, and it preserves the distinction of saying that you're not supposed to engage in simony. Anyway, so I get much more specific about this where I have 4 specific types of obfuscation, which I call bundling, brokerage, gift exchange, and pawning, and I'll walk you through each of them. So bundling is when you take 2 sets of transfers, a market for market transfer and a sacred for sacred transfer, but one person is getting a market good of only token value, and the other person is getting a sacred good of only token value. So for instance, if I knew that one of you in the room was going to be on cap when I go up for full, and I offer to sell you my car for $1, right? So you're getting a car that's worth $15,000. You're paying $1. So there is a market good for a market good. It's just that one of the market goods is practically worthless, the $1. The other market good is worth a fair amount, the used car. And then and then there's also a sacred. You're getting my my full packet, and I'm getting promotion to full that I don't necessarily deserve. And so there's they're not really, in effect, what's happening is I'm paying you a $14,999 bribe for a favorable cap decision, and accomplished through bundling. So this is, if you've read Ronan Farrow's Catch and Kill, you can see that this is basically how Harvey Weinstein was able to suppress news of his despicable behavior for so long, where he would pay journalists for the film rights to their articles. He would option movie rights, and he optioned way more movie rights than he actually needed. Like, typically a producer might option 10, 20 times more pieces of intellectual property than they actually can make into movies, but he would do way more than that. And when Tina Brown was hired to run one of his magazines, she said she was shocked by how many movie option rights the magazine was encumbered with. But it is in principle a legitimate thing for a movie producer to pay a journalist for film option rights. Just basically say, I liked your article, I'm going to get the movie rights to it, and I'll pay you $10,000 for the movie rights to your article. But implicitly, he was buying articles that weren't really worth that much as movies, that didn't really have a lot of movie potential, in order to have influence with those journalists, so that when news came out that he'd been questioned by the NYPD for groping an actress, that he could say, oh, that's nothing, and then the journalist would kill the story. Or conversely, that he could then plant stories saying, oh, back in Italy, this actress used to be a prostitute. And so he could basically preserve his own reputation and slander the reputations of his accusers. And he did it by, not by writing checks to journalists saying, writing in the memo section, bribe to slander a rape victim. He wrote in the memo section of the check, movie rights, which is a normal thing for a movie producer to write in the memo section of a check. All right. Another structure is brokerage. This is when the two parties to the exchange bring in a third party, and the person who wants to buy the sacred good gives a market good, typically money, to the broker. The broker then passes along the market good to the person selling the sacred good, and then the person with the sacred good transfers it to the person who's seeking the sacred good. And so at no point is there ever a market good exchanged for a sacred good. It kind of goes in a cyclical pattern. It's kind of like a Kula ring structurally, where it's like this cyclical process of exchange. So an example of this would be the Jack Abramoff scandal, where actually a lot of political bribery works like this. I could have like 3 or 4 slides that are all more or less identical to this. So most of what the Abramoff scandal was about the Indian tribes that had gaming interests bribing a religious right activist to oppose other Indian tribes who had competing gambling interests. And so the Choctaw Nation paid Jack Abramoff to basically pay Ralph Reed, who was a former president of the Christian Coalition, to oppose rival casinos on the logic that he was an anti-gambling activist. This is what political scientists call a bootlegger Baptist coalition, where you have criminals who have a implicit or explicit alliance with moralists in order to oppose other criminals. And so, but it would have been too obvious what was going on if the Choctaw were to pay Reed, or even if the Choctaw were to pay a lobbyist, and then the lobbyists were to pay Reed. And so what they did is Abramoff arranged for the Choctaw to pay Grover Norquist, who was an anti-tax activist, and then Norquist gave the money to Reed, and then Reed used the money to do the Choctaw favor by attacking their rivals in the gambling industry. All right, really obvious one is gift exchange. So, I don't have to tell anyone on this floor how gift exchange works. But the whole logic of gift exchange, and there's volumes and volumes, especially like basically everything Bourdieu ever wrote on the subject, is about like at what point it's both gift and it's an exchange, right? It's the logic that it's an exchange, but you sublimate the logic of exchange, usually by virtue of having a time delay and making it not explicit that the counter gift is reciprocity for the gift, but everybody kind of knows that in some ways. So the example that got me interested in the subject originally is I was studying payola, and what would typically happen is the record label gives money or concert tickets or something like that to a radio station, and then the radio station plays artists who are on that record label. And it's not explicit, but it's definitely implicit. You can read these subpoenaed emails, and you can see the winks in the emails. You know, that implicitly the reciprocity for these gifts is airplay. And then the last structure is pawning. Pawning is when you take on an explicit debt and you stake implicitly or explicitly as collateral something that you wouldn't be willing to sell. And then at some point you're unable to repay this market debt with market goods, and so you repay them with a sacred good. So this is very common in ethnographic cases, in that this is basically how debt slavery works. It's fairly, I'm not aware of any cases in the ethnographic record. It doesn't mean that there aren't any where people explicitly sell their children into slavery, but it's very common for people to go into debt and stake a dependent as collateral for the debt. And then when they're unable to repay the debt, the moneylender seizes the dependent as a slave, a debt slave. But this also happens in weird cultures. So if you've ever seen the movie Goodfellas, it doesn't go into the details of this in the movie, but in the book that it's based on, it talks about how the way that they had all those inside men to help them with all those robberies of JFK Airport is they owned all the bars across the street from JFK Airport, and more importantly, they owned the bookies who operated out of the bars at JFK Airport. And all the airport workers were degenerate gamblers and would go to these airport bars and get way into debt on sportsbook. And this is mob interest, so they're paying very high interest rates. They can't afford to even pay the interest. And at a certain point they say, I'm going to tell you the perfect plan to rob my place of work, kill some of my coworkers, and steal millions of dollars from my employer. They wouldn't necessarily go to the mob and say, I will do this for a 10% cut, but they would do it to get out of their gambling debts, right? So people aren't necessarily willing to do something despicable like sell their children into slavery. Or another case that worked the same way is, so you guys remember that about a year ago, Notre Dame burned down in Paris, and the chaplain for the Paris Fire Department ran inside to save the crown of thorns. If you think for a second, what was the crown of thorns doing in Paris? Right? Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. It doesn't seem immediately obvious why it should be in Paris. The reason that the crown of thorns was in Paris is that after the Edict of Milan in 312, Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, went on a pilgrimage and basically went on a big relic shopping spree, saying, I'll take that, I'll take that, I'll take that. And she collected all these holy relics, or what she thought were holy relics, and she took them back to Constantinople. And so for centuries actually, what was purported to be the crown of thorns was in Constantinople. Fast forward, they lose a bunch of wars to the Turks. They're really hard up for cash. And they say it would be really nice if we had a big loan from Latin Christians so that we could hire some mercenaries so we could fight the Turks and get back our Anatolian tax base. And people said to the Byzantines, yeah, you're not really good for it. And they said, well, what if we put up some collateral, like the crown of thorns? They predictably lost their next war to the Turks, and then the Venetian bankers turned around and sold it to the French. So that's how the crown of thorns wound up in Paris. It's not that you would sell the crown of thorns. Right, you're not going to sell a passion relic, but you will use it to collateralize a debt. And even if you kind of know in the back of your mind that you're never really going to be able to redeem the debt. So that's how pawning works. Anyway, so these are the structures, and I'll go through some case studies where you can see multiple structures working in the same person. I really like Caro's volume 2 of his LBJ biography because it involves all 4 structures. President Johnson, when he was Representative Johnson, lobbyists would tell people who wanted favors from the congressman that you really want to make sure that you buy advertising time on his radio station before you go and ask him for a favor. The same way that foreign diplomats know that it's always a good idea to stay at a Trump hotel in DC. Like you want to stay at the Trump National before you go, and you could just say, Mr. President, I was at your hotel last night. I had a great night's sleep. It's a beautiful hotel. Just to butter him up, like, you know. So same kind of way, people would buy advertising time on LBJ's Austin, Texas radio station. And there's some cases where people did this even though they didn't sell products in Austin, right? So, I mean, imagine that there was an advertisement for Ralph's Supermarket or something like that in Austin, Texas. And there are no Ralph's supermarkets in Austin, Texas. And really what was happening is that you have this sacred circuit of a constituent request for a policy favor, and then you have this market request of ad time for money, both of which are legitimate in and of themselves, but the trick is that they're really cross-subsidizing each other. Really, some of the money for the ad buy is really going to bribe the congressman. How did he get that radio station in the first place? He didn't have the option rights to buy it. Part of what he did was that he set up roadblocks to anybody else buying it to drive down the price, to make it worthless. Kind of like if I want to buy a piece of property, I might file an environmental impact lawsuit against it to keep you from building anything on it. And then the property becomes almost worthless, so you're willing to sell it for anything. And then I buy it, and then I basically drop the environmental lawsuit. That's more or less what he did, except with telecom regulation. But he called in a favor where the guy who owned the option right to purchase the station, he had gotten that guy's son into the Naval Academy. And so he basically was trading one of his congressional perks, right? Because the way that the military academy works, they don't read over your SAT and stuff like that like we do at UCLA. It's almost explicitly a patronage system where congressmen are allowed to allocate slots. And so he traded, via gift exchange, admission to Annapolis Naval Academy for the option rights to purchase the radio station. Then, just to make it even, one more step of insulation, technically LBJ didn't buy the radio station, Lady Bird bought the radio station. And when journalists would question LBJ and say, isn't it kind of sketchy that you're meeting with all these lobbyists who just bought airtime on your radio station? He's like, oh, Lady Bird runs his radio station. I don't have anything to do with it, which was total bullshit. He ran the radio station, but it was in Lady Bird's name. And so Lady Bird was acting as a broker between the lobbyist and LBJ to insulate what would otherwise be bribes. And then you also see pawning in this case, in that whenever he took someone onto his staff, he would offer them a large personal loan, but not the salary where they could realistically pay back that personal loan. And that's because he wanted them in his debt so that they'd be very loyal to him. And so we also see pawning going on with this. A recent ethnographic case, Kimberly Huang wrote a very good article in American Sociological Review in 2018 that's part of her forthcoming book on global elites, where she's looking at how do real estate developers bribe politicians or party officials or whatever you call them in Vietnam. And she talked about a distinction between local officials, local investors, that is to say, Vietnamese economic elites, regional investors, by which she mostly means people from Korea and Singapore, and global, by whom she means Americans, Canadians, and Japanese. And she showed that the three different types of investors would engage in different styles of obfuscation, where the locals would engage in gift-giving practices, where they would cultivate long-run relationships with the politicians. They would give elaborate gifts to them. Very often these took the form of handbags that they would give to the politicians and saying, here's a handbag for your wife. But everyone involved in this knew perfectly well that the wife could fly to Hong Kong and redeem the handbag for cash, almost like giving someone a casino poker chip. And the regional investors, that is to say the Koreans and the Singaporeans, would do a certain amount of that gift giving, but they would also do bundling in the form of hiring the politicians' kids, and also a certain amount of brokerage via the kids. And then the global investors would engage in brokerage in the sense that, so America, Canada, and Japan all have versions of what in America is called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which says that if anyone in this room, as a U.S. person, were to go overseas and bribe a non-U.S. person overseas, we could still be prosecuted in a U.S. court, right? So even if it happens overseas, you can still be prosecuted for bribery in a U.S. court. In fact, this is such a strong law that Kimberly had to change from participant observation to ethnographic interviews because the University of Chicago was worried that by virtue of being in the room for this stuff, she would be violating the law. So anyway, so U.S., Canadian, and Japanese investors, they don't directly bribe the officials. What they do is that they hire a local law firm or a local public relations firm, and they don't ask for a very detailed billing statement. They don't want to know what the billable hours are, right? They'll just keep them on retainer, and they kind of know that the law firm is really taking half of their fees and just turning them over as bribes, that the law firm is basically a glorified money launderer. But they really don't want to know, because if they knew, then they could be prosecuted under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This is very common. About 2/3 of all federal prosecutions in the United States under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act involve this sort of practice, where it's not the U.S. company directly bribing someone overseas, but the U.S. company hires some type of local fixer, and then it turns out that the fixer is really just a money launderer. We can also see something happening all in the same interaction. So this is my attempt to summarize Ashley Mears's 2015 American Sociological Review article on bottle service, mostly at New York nightclubs. And so what happens is that really rich guys go to expensive nightclubs and they buy $2,000 bottles of champagne or $2,000 bottles of vodka. Now obviously that bottle of champagne or vodka is not worth $2,000. Even at bar prices it's worth, $100, $200. So 90% of that, all that markup, that 1,000% markup, is basically a way to indirectly pay to have girls at the table flirting with them, right? You're not really paying for the champagne, you're paying for the arm candy. But this is heavily insulated, and because you're not paying 19-year-old models to go to a bar with you. You're not like handing a 19-year-old model $200 saying, come hang out with me tonight so I look glamorous. You're just paying an elevated price for the champagne. And it's normal to pay money for drinks, so you don't feel like you're paying to have women make you look like a big shot. You're just paying for drinks, which is normal. And then the club doesn't even work directly with the girls. They work with promoters, and they pay the promoters basically on commission. He basically gets a cut of the table, and the promoters are basically all men. And then, interestingly, the promoters don't pay the girls either. They basically flirt with the girls and they give them gifts. And they kind of take them on group dates and stuff like that before. And so there's kind of a gift exchange relationship between the promoter and the models. And then there's a bundling relationship between the nightclub and the customer. And then, it's basically every one of the obfuscation structures except for pawning is involved in this. All right. So now I want to go through quickly on some of the experiments that are in the 2018 ASR. These were all Amazon MTurk. If you're wondering, we did check. We had a couple of checks to see if these were basically fake MTurks. This was a little bit before the VPN problem got out of hand, but we checked anyway, and we didn't see repeated GPS coordinates. We had pretty good stuff on the attention screens. We did everything we could to make sure this was okay. Anyway, so, and then we wrote a couple of stories, which all had in common that we wrote the same story 6 different ways. One where there was a disreputable quid pro quo. I will pay you $10,000 for something that I ought not be paying you for. Another where I'm just asking you for something that if I was offering to pay for it, it would be wrong, but it's fine for me to ask for it. And then 4 obfuscation structures. In each case, the obfuscation structure nets $10,000 for the person who would be selling the sacred good. So one of the cases we based on the congressman who had all that cash in his freezer, and we wrote a vignette, and the black text is the part that was constant, and the blue text is the part that was rotated out, and we had 6 different versions, but suffice to say, these are all in the appendix of the paper if you want to see, but we don't need to read it right now. But basically, a guy who sells modems to the Army meets with a congressman, says, I want your help selling these modems to the Army. And then either the congressman says, sure, but you owe me $10,000 in a campaign donation, or there's some type of way where effectively they find a way to hide the $10,000. Or he just says, can you please help me? I think I sell great modems and they'd help the Army. And so, and then we asked questions saying, oh, that's the wrong version of the dependent variable, but it doesn't matter. Oh yeah, no, this is the right version. Okay. So we asked, what about the congressman? how do you think he was very good, very bad, 1 to 7? The congressman, should he be punished, not punished at all, severely punished? And then we ask the same questions about the modem guy. And then we just take the average of those questions. And so high values mean that you hate these people, low values mean you think they're fine. And you can see that the quid pro quo is the worst. And then just can you help me sell these modems to the Army is the least worst. And then the obfuscated versions of the exchange are all in the middle, a little bit closer to the quid pro quo. And I think the reason that they're a little bit closer to the quid pro quo is because this is a one-page vignette. And so the facts are all there and obvious, whereas in real life, these facts would be scattered across different documents. They wouldn't be as salient. Basically, if we made the vignette an entire book and we hid the relevant facts, in chapter 10 versus chapter 30, I don't think anyone would even notice that there's something sketchy going on. But anyway, we'll get into that. We did a very similar thing with a real story involving commercial bribery at Honda in the 80s and 90s. There was a markup on Accords because Honda didn't make enough Accords, and so car dealers would bribe Honda corporate to get more Accords shipped to their lot instead of somebody else's dealership. And there was a federal prosecution and everything. And you see basically the same pattern that we saw in political bribery. Also did a vignette involving baby selling, where we tell a story about a young woman who gets pregnant. She doesn't want to keep the baby, and a guy she knows at work says, me and my wife have been trying to have a baby. We'd like to adopt your baby. And in most versions of the story, he directly or indirectly offers her $10,000 for her baby. And then another version, he basically just says, we'll give it a good home. And this one, you see less of an effect. There's a certain amount of scale compression here. People don't see that the quid pro quo condition is as bad as they thought the bribery stories were bad. And people also are a little bit less comfortable with the non-transactional version. And then if you decompose this, you can see that there's actually a pretty strong asymmetry. People hate the birth mother, whereas they seem to feel pretty much okay about the adoptive parents. Our respondents seem to feel that it's okay to want to acquire a baby, even if you're willing to pay for the baby, but there's something creepy about willing to give up your baby. There was a little bit of this asymmetry in the bribery conditions, but not nearly so extreme. So I don't know whether this is something about parenting being an honorable state and seeking to enter parenting is better than seeking to exit parenting, or whether it's something about gendered expectations of motherhood or something like that. But there's definitely something interesting going on. And then the last one, which was not in the paper, because the reviewers thought, this doesn't make sense, but I'm on the 3rd floor, so I want to tell it, is we took Bohannon and Bohannon, 55, and we basically explained the theory to them, and then we said to them, to the MTurk workers, we gave them the gist of Bohannon, and then we told them that we want you to code, you've been hired to code the ethnographer's field notes to see whether the field notes confirm with the theory. And so we weren't asking them, do you think it's gross to sell yams for brass rods? Because why would you care, right? You're an American. But we were asking them, is this consistent with the anthropologist's theory that people won't sell yams for brass rods? And in some versions of them, it's just, here's my brass rods, give me your yams. And then in other versions of it, it's like, well, I'm going to give you some brass rods, and then 2 months later, I'm going to ask you for some yams, So basically, gift exchange, or we had a brass rod broker, And here, if anything, the effects are even stronger than they were in the other conditions. People people recognize that the quid pro quo version violates the theory that you're not going to trade brass rods for yams. People mostly recognize that and actually the bottom of the scale is 1, not 0, right? So people basically recognize that just saying, can you please give me some yams doesn't violate the rule against trading brass rods for yams. No, actually, it's can you please give me some brass rods. People just say, can you please give me some brass rods doesn't really violate the rule. And then with these obfuscated conditions, people kind of felt in the middle, right, just like before. So this was somewhat inspired by man, what's her name? It's a Greek name. She's an evolutionary psychologist. She did this thing on the Wason selection task, but then she phrased it as like, if you have facial tattoos. Thank you, Lita Cosmides. Yeah, this was kind of inspired by her work, where she gave a culturally unfamiliar taboo, and then she gave it to people, and she saw that people were able to solve the logic puzzle with a culturally unfamiliar taboo, just because it's social, right? And so we basically found the same pattern with this. Anyway, so that is the ASR plus the deleted scene that you'll only find on the special edition of the DVD from the ASR. And then for the book, I want to talk about a bunch of other cases. Like, how do you see this occurring in different cases? Pharmaceutical marketing is a big one. Pharmaceutical marketing works basically the same way as payola does, where pharma reps bribe doctors to prescribe their drugs and not somebody else's drugs, or at least they did until a couple of years ago when very stringent reporting requirements were put in place. There's all sorts of weird economic taboos in ancient Rome, where Roman senators weren't supposed to do anything commercial, but they did, right? They weren't supposed to invest in commercial enterprises, and so they would typically find a member. So the Roman Senate, which is basically the aristocracy, weren't supposed to invest in commercial ventures, but the Roman knights, who were basically the Roman bourgeoisie, were allowed to do that. And so you would typically see a Roman senator would be the silent partner behind a Roman knight, and then the Roman knight would be kind of the front man. So that's an example of brokerage. You also saw Roman senators weren't supposed to engage in professional services for each other. Like, you weren't supposed to have a job as a lawyer. But like anyone who knows anything about classics knows that Cicero was a professional lawyer. So how did that work? The way it worked is that Cicero worked as your lawyer for free, and then you wrote him into your will. I don't know whether the obvious thing happened if he was especially apt to represent people who were older, right? That was a way to get around the taboo, where it was considered honorable to do favors for your friends and then have them remember you in their will, whereas it wouldn't have been considered honorable to just say, my billable hours start at 300 sesterci an hour, right? All sorts of things with social media marketing, where there's all sorts of weird things like influencers being bribed and that sort of thing. I think you can see some of this with Tibu competition, where some people who wouldn't be willing to send their kids to private school are willing to, they don't consider it inegalitarian to buy a house in Santa Monica or Beverly Hills. Oh, well, I'm committed to sending my kids to public school in a rich neighborhood, You see some of this in scientific university industry patents. So under the Bayh-Dole Act, American universities mostly just develop patents and then license them like any other developer would. But prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, and still to a large extent in Japan, you see patronage relationships between labs and industry people, where I will develop a product and then you've basically paid for all the equipment in my lab, and so I just give you my patents. You see stuff like Rent-A-Vet, where the federal government has very strong affirmative action for veterans, especially disabled veterans, and for government contracting. And so you'll see businesses hire disabled veterans to act as frontmen for the business so that they can get access to these government contracts. They pay the disabled veteran 5%, but really you're dealing with this ordinary business. And there's a very similar practice in Southeast Asia. A lot of countries that have a Han Chinese ethnic minority, the Han Chinese are market dominant, and then the Malay majority will sometimes have certain affirmative action policies. And it's very common to have partnerships between Han Chinese and Malays. And basically the Malay person makes you eligible for various policies, but really the person actually running the business is the Han Chinese market dominant minority. And then there's all sorts of research questions I want to get into. I think that all this stuff can change how the exchange works, but I feel like at this point it's probably best just to turn over to Q&A. Yeah, Alan.
Great talk, and I'm really pleased to catch up with.
Thanks.
Doing some underlying all this is the phenomenon that people in a given culture,
Yeah.
if they have market exchange at all, if they have some kind of proportional idea or money, it's not quite clear what the issue is, whether it's proportionality or money, think that some things shouldn't be transacted for money.
Yes.
And then the question is, well, why?
Mm-hmm.
Why not? And what the rules are, of course, vary enormously.
Yes.
So in West Africa, 50 years ago, I guess, a long time, 40 years ago, if a guy wanted to date a girl, right, wanted to have sex with her, she would say no unless he gave her money, and she would be insulted if he didn't offer her some money.
Yeah.
So
We still see that, by the way, in Western cultures with rough trade, where in rough trade prostitution, this is an institution where straight identifying men act as commercial sex workers for gay men, typically as sexually dominant. So basically, from the client's perspective, you're paying a straight guy to penetrate you. And one of the interesting things about rough trade is that they insist on being paid. And if a guy tells a rough trade, I'm in love with you and I want to set you up as an apartment, in an apartment to be my boyfriend, that would be much more valuable to the rough trade person than just getting paid, $50 for a particular sex act would. But he will refuse it because that implies that this is a relationship about love rather than about commercial payment. And by demanding payment, it's framed as a job rather than as a sexuality. And it reaffirms his identity in that respect. So, I mean, we can still...
There's a different reason, but
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all I'm saying is it's not obvious if you stop from Mars.
Yeah.
Or in what's going to be permissible to buy and sell in a particular culture, or if it is obvious, I don't know what,
Yeah.
How it's obvious.
Yeah.
But it's very widespread, right? And in Bohannon's and other work on spheres of exchange,
Yeah.
Even when it's not currency involved, right? Even when it's not money,
Yeah.
there are often in a culture that has no money, things that you're not supposed to exchange. You can exchange things within this sphere of each other, that's
Yeah.
fine. And the other sphere, which is usually payment for killing somebody,
Yeah.
wives, bride price,
Yeah.
and sometimes.
Things having to do with human life,
Yes.
or tokens of human life, like
But
cattle.
those things can be exchanged for each other, and
Yeah.
that's fine, and nothing, but you can't exchange across the domains. So, why is it?
So, if you talk to the moral philosophers, they will tell you that depending on which moral philosophers you talk to, they'll either do the weird culture rule of saying, well, we know that a lot of things are just gross, but we're not allowed to talk about that, and so we're going to do this one hand tied behind our back thing of trying to argue that it's really about exploitation. I don't believe that, and the weird theory kind of came out of this room in some ways, so I think most of you probably don't believe that either as a positive theory of how people behave. But there's another model which is perhaps not satisfying because it's somewhat tautological, although I think it has a lot going for it, which is that some things are just gross. Sandel, the philosopher, talks about coercion and corruption. And by coercion, he means coerced by economic necessity. I think exploitation is probably a better word for it, because it doesn't mean gun to your head. It just means you're economically desperate, so you'll sell a kidney. And then he also talks about corruption, by which he doesn't mean bribery. He means it corrupts the sacred nature of something. So, my political judgment is sacred, and it would be corrupting of the sacredness of my civic franchise if I were to be paid for my vote. Or, the political judgment of my congressman is sacred, and it would corrupt the sacred nature.
But it is tautological, if I can ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
Because your definition of sacred, Phil Tetlock, who's the guy who does best known for this.
Yeah.
The definition of sacred is you can't exchange it for money.
Yeah. I agree it's tautological. And I'm somewhat comfortable with saying it's tautological because it's just kind of socially arbitrary. Now, I think that there probably are some correlates, and that typically things that involve profound intimacy are probably most likely to have this. So, you know, if we were to use your typology, stuff that is strongly CS is probably a little bit more apt to fall in this than stuff that, you know, but again, that's somewhat tautological, because that's just saying that something that belongs in one relational model doesn't belong in another. Yeah, but it's very interesting that there are differences between what belongs in one culture, right? You already gave the example that some cultures are very comfortable commodifying sex and or marriage. You know, and likewise, you know, you gave the example of weregild, but there's some cultures where weregild is preferred, right? Germanic cultures basically preferred weregild, whereas Mediterranean cultures considered weregild to be taboo. There's a passage in the Bible that says, don't accept a wrongful death payment in lieu of a blood vendetta. You've got to pursue the blood vendetta, you know, which is the exact opposite of the Germanic custom, which is the Germanic custom basically being only pursue a blood vendetta as leverage to get the weregild payment. So yes.
So I was wondering about the like, categorization of things into
Yeah.
either sacred or market goods.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how do things transition from one to the other? Because I mean, I'm sure there are, you know, in particular places and times, you know, you have slavery in ancient Rome, which then, you know, became not okay. You have prostitution, which is legalized sometimes.
Yeah.
Is it always? I just wanted to, you know if you could talk a little bit about that process and whether it was, you know, is it by moving through some of these obfuscations, you know, that then once they become commonplace, it becomes revealed, or? Yeah,
so I'm actually, so there's kind of two questions there. One is, how do taboos become relaxed? You know, and I would draw a distinction between a taboo being present but widely evaded, but in principle people would agree with the taboo, versus taboos just being coming down the thing at all. I think obfuscation, at least in the short run, provides a workaround so that you can kind of give lip service to the taboo while evading it in practice. And I think the case of interest, like money at interest, usury, is interest here, because during the Middle Ages, Christianity and Islam had fairly strong interest taboos, both of which were grounded in essentially, well, first of all, in scriptural passages, but also in kind of Aristotelian notions of interest being like a weird money for nothing kind of thing. And what you saw in Christianity was an explicit attack on the idea of the usury taboo, you know, and so like Nelson and Weber separately, you know, talk about this. And how it was that roughly during the Protestant Reformation, Christians became comfortable with the idea of charging interest. Whereas Islam had a completely different idea, which is that from the very beginning, Islam has opposed charging interest, but also from practically the very beginning, they figured out workarounds where you can more or less charge interest while pretending you're not. And the fact is that basically no Christians currently oppose the idea of charging an interest. Right? They may oppose a certain interest rate, or they may oppose certain types of collateral. They may think maybe you should have bankruptcy or something like that. But almost no Christians are uncomfortable with interest in principle. Whereas, you know, basically all Muslims are uncomfortable with the idea of interest in principle, even if most of them are comfortable with workarounds for it. So that's a case where the rule being flexible by allowing obfuscation actually preserves the rule, or at least lip service to the rule. Whereas the rule, the way that you really destroy taboo is just arguing against it. So if we were to take a taboo in the current United States, like say the taboo on kidney sales, and let's say that we wanted to eliminate that taboo, I think that having a obfuscation for that taboo, but still preserving the taboo in principle, could actually preserve it more than simply arguing against it and simply saying, you know, we should have kidney sales because reasons X, Y, and Z, right? That a frontal assault on the taboo, an explicit moral argument, may be more effective at completely eliminating it, even as the obfuscation can kind of get you most of the way there in the short run. I'm not 100% sure about that. I could easily see cases that would work more like you were suggesting, where you know, people eventually realize that the taboo is effectively a dead letter, and let's just get rid of it entirely. This was
So, thanks for sharing this.
sure.
This is really, really interesting stuff and things that I hadn't thought about a lot. I'd like to take you out later.
Oh yeah, sure.
That was a joke.
Yeah. Oh, that was sketchy. Well, I thought maybe you were saying like the you know, the opening thing of like I didn't schedule meetings, but that's certainly complicated.
Sorry. Bad idea.
That's fine. But that actually illustrates a point, right? Which is that one of the nice things about obfuscation is it provides plausible deniability,
Which is
because
what-
there's an alternate interpretation.
Yeah, so this is actually where I'm going, which
Yes.
is, I mean, the wealth of examples that you provided, you know, I find it quite compelling. I think your typology is very useful.
thanks.
And I can see, you know, lots of examples both from the modern world, from the historical West, and ethnographically, cross-culturally. But it seems to me that what is missing in your, at least in your presentation here, and it's unclear whether that's missing in your book as well.
The
is
book's not written yet, so it
Right,
will be once you give me the example.
Which
Yeah.
is exactly why
Yeah.
you're gonna take me out to lunch and I'm providing this.
That's it. That sounds good. Yeah.
What's missing from the argument is the explanation.
Mhm.
You have an exegesis, you have a typology.
Yes.
But you don't have an explanation. And
Mhm.
it strikes me that the explanation, so there are two levels at which, you've alluded to this repeatedly,
Mhm.
which is the difference between the public presentation and the private moral compass.
Mhm.
And you've said, well, you know, people can justify it this way,
Yeah.
or they can defend it in public this way,
Mhm.
which you've also said, and yet people are comfortable with it this way, right?
Mhm.
The same person who is comfortable, you know, being a sugar daddy might not be comfortable being a John. for
Yeah,
example,
and
right?
I have a case in the social theory where, so there was this cardiologist who made it like his side project to debunk the FBI's favorite expert witness. One of the weird things about forensic science is a lot of it is basically witchcraft. And this cardiologist debunked one of the FBI's favorite expert witnesses and got a lot of convictions thrown out. So as you might imagine, the FBI was not a huge fan of this guy. And they discovered that he had an account on a website called sugardaddyforme.com. They got a female FBI agent to create an account and basically she sent him an email saying, I'll suck your dick for $1,000. And he indignantly wrote back, I'm looking for a sugar baby, not a hooker, there's a big difference between that. Then the FBI agent created a second account saying, I'm going to be in your town on business, I'm looking for a generous man, right? Basically framed it all the right ways. He said, sure, I'll have dinner with you. And then freeze, you're under arrest. This goes to federal court and the judge throws it out. Most of the judge's decision is actually about what it means to move a woman across state lines. It's like very technical federalism type stuff. But the judge also says like, oh, obviously this is a dating relationship that he was trying to set up. Now, I suspect that the judge was partly saying that because he realized that FBI was acting in bad faith to retaliate against someone who got a lot of innocent people out of prison, or at least people who weren't shown beyond a reasonable doubt out of prison. But it's interesting that this doctor, like he didn't know that the FBI was reading that first email. And he seemed to sincerely think that there is a big difference. Like he saw himself as, I'm a generous man, you know, who will date attractive women. But I don't pay for sex, right? This did seem to be an important, even though you or I might think, oh, come on, who's he kidding? But he was kidding. He was kidding himself and he was kidding the judge.
So let me point you in the direction of some work that might be useful.
Yeah,
in this
please.
respect. Peter Descioli and Robert Kurzban and colleagues, and their argument, so they actually begin with the trolley problem and the question of why, you know, sins of omission are different than sins of commission, right? And their explanation is that what matters is the coordination of actors in a punishing environment, right? So if punishment is costly to the actors, but collectively administered punishment is cheap, and there is both public and private good to administering punishment, then potential punishers will always be looking for coordination points in the Schelling sense, where they can say, oh yeah, we all agree that this is an action worthy of punishment, right? And our punishment is meritorious. So in that environment, then actors who may be subject to punishment are themselves always looking to see, well, to what extent could potential punishers agree that my actions are punishment worthy? So plausible deniability in the sort of, LBJ sense of what's going on there is actually part of the evolved psychology, in that people find morally acceptable actions which are inherently obfuscated, right? Which doesn't mean that there aren't Machiavellian LBJ actors who intentionally set up these situations, but it does mean that the cardiologist could have been completely sincere in his moral sentiments, right? And that and what Dischioli and Kurzban argue is that there's a reason for that, and that is that psychology has evolved in the context of punishers who are looking for coordination points for punishment.
So this sounds kind of similar to Haidt's rational tale, although what I hear different from Haidt is that he's basically talking about ex post rationalizations. And they're saying that this is anticipatory, that I will shape my behavior towards the ambiguous thing.
And they're saying that that has been a selection pressure over time, such that it isn't a conscious calculation, it's a sincere subjective experience, right? So the cardiologist isn't saying, well, maybe that's law enforcement out there, I better cover my ass in my responses to these messages, right? The cardiologist is saying, no, there's fundamentally a difference between these two things. But what matters, what the difference derives from, is that is the subjective difference for the cardiologist, is a long history of punishers coordinating where they can agree with one another, such that those who would be subject to punishment have evolved the ability to anticipate when there is clarity and when there is obfuscation.
That makes a lot of sense. I'll have to make sure I get the correct version cited later. Yes, sir.
First, thanks for an interesting talk. I had a couple questions about something you had mentioned towards the beginning with respect to sort of the institutionalization of some kinds of obfuscation. And I was wondering, basically, to what extent do you think the institutionalization of obfuscation is, genuinely transformative of the exchange, such that it's no longer morally disreputable, versus, representing genuine departures from sort of the paradigmatic case. So, thinking about sort of the Reba case in usury, So from an economist's perspective, the idea of paying, $1,100 a year from now is functionally the same as charging, $1,000 plus interest or whatever. But at a year and 1 day, you see that those two are actually splitting insofar as there's a boundedness on this permissible case, and there isn't necessarily boundedness. So that seems like a meaningfully different distinction.
But what the Islamic scholars tend to focus on is whether there's shared risk for any time. And that if they can find some way to argue that there's shared risk at any time, then it's okay. And if there's not shared risk, then it's not. But they're drawing this qualitative distinction on that basis. But go ahead.
Okay. Either way, it seems like there is still a meaningful qualitative difference in terms of how that is sort of borne out in the real world. And so that is one thing. And then the other component here that I was thinking about is, if it's not genuinely transformative, or it's not just sort of identifying these cases that are genuine departures from the morally disreputable paradigm, how much of the institutionalization of these things are just shell games where you're sort of waiting for everybody else to catch up. Think about lobbying, for example. That's a case where
so I do think that there is an arms race, like a Red Queen race for obfuscation going on. You see this clearly in payola, where every 14 years there's a payola scandal. It's like a cicada. Actually, there was. We just missed one. There should have been one last year. But there, and I think, and if you look at the details, each scandal has different. The big picture is always the same. The record labels are always paying to get airplay, but the details are completely different. from how payola worked in the 50s versus how it worked in the 70s versus how it worked in the 80s versus how it worked in 2004. And I think that this is actually because institutionalizing obfuscation, far from it making it more acceptable, it makes it more fragile. So institutionalizing obfuscation does two things. Number one is, like any economic institution, it makes it more cognitively accessible, right? So like if you talk to the economists and you say, well, all these assumptions you're making, people aren't that smart. And they'll say, yes, people aren't that smart that they could figure it out themselves. But once the institution's developed, people are smart enough to buy into the institution. I wouldn't necessarily have been able to invent the idea of an index fund myself. But once an index fund exists, I can just put, $10,000 in the Vanguard. And it's very easy for me to have relatively low risk investment that way. So institutionalizing an obfuscation makes it easier to engage in. So let's say that I wanted to hire a prostitute, but I didn't want to think of myself as some kind of person who pays for sex, and I'd never heard of a sugar baby. This might be quite a quandary for me, and I would just have to forego that transaction, right? I just have to say, well, it would be nice if there was some way to have my cake and eat it too, but I guess I'm just not going to hire a prostitute. Or I'm going to do it and just openly incur the shame. But one way or another, I'm not going to have this kind of have my cake and eat it too. Morally think. Once I hear about there's this thing called sugar daddies, and it's like, oh, I could do that. There's even websites that let me do it. Then it becomes very cognitively easy for people to say, oh, here's this economic institution that allows me to do it. The trouble with it is this also becomes cognitively available to the audience. So Goffman says that good accounts get bad names, by which he means that, by an account, he means like an exculpatory account, like an excuse. So the classical one would be like, my dog ate my homework, or I need to turn in, we've all heard, my grandma died, I need to turn in my midterm late. And so precisely because these are such good excuses, the audience for the excuse kind of gets the idea. And it kind of becomes a little bit too obvious that this is what you're trying to accomplish. And so by the very virtue of it being so well institutionalized, it makes it easier to do, but it also makes it more vulnerable to denunciation. And you saw this with Islamic finance, where for hundreds of years, people were comfortable with these economic institutions that, looked like interest, quacked like interest, but in theory weren't interest. And then beginning in the 1940s, 1950s, you had this kind of wave of post-colonialism, and Islam kind of got picked up in that project, and people denouncing it. And so it created a vulnerability for a more radical form of the Islamic finance movement to attack it precisely because it was so institutionalized. So, yeah, I don't think institutionalism makes something better. I think it makes it easier, but it also makes it more vulnerable. Okay.
Great presentation. It's really refreshing to see a different perspective, but one that's pretty recognizable still. The case studies that you provide are great for illustrating, the sort of expert level of forms that these transactions take shape. And I just wonder, I'm wondering from a standpoint of somebody who's doing this research, are you more interested? A lot of the examples you gave seem to be on the real far margins of, market economies, and also some of these strategies make sense for or only acceptable to situations where you have huge imbalances in wealth and purchasing power. That's also going to be creating markets for things that most people over most of human history, this level of elaborate obfuscation, there was never really an ecology demanding that because of the, in an evolutionary sense, a lot of the conditions that are surrounding the legal conditions, perhaps some of the moral institutions, and as well as inequality are pretty recent.
Well, I mean, the big one, because most people throughout human history didn't have markets.
Yeah, right, of course.
At least not in any kind of record.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, as so when you create this book that you're working on,
Yeah.
is your target more towards, let's take the case studies to find examples of this typology and see what's the context in which they arose in?
Mhm.
Or are you more interested in like a more general historical evolutionary perhaps story about how this phenomena originally arises and then becomes elaborated over history and time?
Yeah.
And
So
that's your
I'm a
approach.
sociologist, so we
Yeah.
only study weird people, right? We don't
Okay.
study outside of market. So I'm not interested in human nature per se,
Mhm.
like, you know, capital H, capital N, human
Yeah.
nature. If it could apply to that in some ways, that's great, and I think you have, now, obviously people don't have an evolved mechanism for specifically exchange obfuscation, because exchange itself was not the dominant form of human relation for most of human history.
I will push back on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Because you could think of that, you could imagine an evolutionary scenario where you begin with a default form of human
Mhm.
society in which things of value are
Yeah.
being exchanged in very elaborate ways, just without a currency.
Yeah,
So you know, you're making investments in relationships, you know, variably with
Yeah.
people who might be advantageous for you at some point. You make a lot of calculations,
yeah,
and I work with a hunter-gatherer society that has very little access to money,
mhm,
and I think all of the savvy moral calculus and economic calculations that are a part of some of your typologies are already in place.
Mm.
It's just that when you
Mm.
start putting this into a state context with a currency and a legal system and increase the inequality in the society, it's going to take a lot of different shape. But you're already starting with a sort of human psychology that's pretty flexible.
yeah, I was
and
going to
solid.
agree with that
Yeah.
part. Like, I think Dan was right to say that we have, we basically have evolved the bullshit, you know, even if we haven't necessarily evolved the bullshit about this isn't really a market, you know.
Yeah.
So let me try this on for you, because like, I kind of agree with you that even if there's not markets per se, you could have cases where there's like spheres of exchange that would have existed through basically all human cultures.
Absolutely.
Right, so the big one, in my non-expert opinion, but you can confirm it, would probably be like bride exchange. So if you have paternal lineages, and in theory the only reciprocity for a bride is a bride, but in the short run it's not a terribly liquid market.
Mhm.
And so people can exchange other goods or services to kind of like make sure that you get a bride and compared to some other paternal lineage gets a bride.
There are placeholders
Yeah,
that you can use later, but only use.
yeah,
I mean, so you don't get in those systems, people giving you piles of food that will spoil.
mm-hmm.
You only get certain things, cattle or brass hose.
Yeah, well, yeah, my understanding is that like, you know, brass rods or cattle or something like that are the preferred, like ideally you trade a bride for a bride. And then kind of the next best is you have cattle or brass rods or giant stone coins or something.
Right.
And then,
But those things
Yeah.
that you're getting in place of a bride,
yeah,
because they don't have a bride,
yeah,
the only thing they can be used for is to get a bride or to pay, if our group has killed one of yours and we don't want one of ours killed, that's the only other use for it.
so, that's my understanding, but like I remember in Bohannon, and also Graeber talks a little bit about this, there's a little bit of a loophole where in theory you can only trade brass rods for slaves or cattle or whatever, but in practice every once in a while somebody trades a bunch of yams for a brass rod, and then if I trade a bunch of yams for your brass rod, I'll basically brag about what a good deal I made, and you'll be kind of ashamed of it. But it does occasionally happen. And, you know, presumably it wouldn't happen openly, precisely because you would be ashamed of having given up your patrimony of this brass rod for just a bunch of perishable yams.
I don't know
Yeah.
if that occurs. But, yeah, there's certainly a placeholder function.
Yeah.
Like, we're holding on to this until you can give us a bride, or until somebody else. This also allows, like currency, a three-way exchange.
Yeah,
So you give us a bride, we give you a bunch of brass rods.
yeah,
We don't, we don't have a bride to give you,
Yeah.
but they do.
Yeah.
And the brass rods can go over there, and then, yeah. So it permits 3- and 4-way exchanges that wouldn't be possible by what's called direct reciprocity.
Yeah.
Brian, you had more than you were.
Oh, well, I don't want to take up more time than you do. I could talk to you afterwards.
Sure.
It's great talk.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks for coming.
Anyone else have any questions?
So this is less of a question, more just like your thoughts.
Yeah.
So if I go to a friend's dinner,
Yeah.
and after dinner I just put down $30 and I leave,
Mhm.
that would be considered, it's not illegal, but it's considered like morally inappropriate or
I
not
don't know
socially
if it'd be considered
acceptable.
immoral, but it would definitely be considered tacky.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or socially unacceptable.
Yeah.
But if I brought like a $30 bottle of wine,
That's right.
or even there's an expectation to bring a $30 bottle of wine, that's
Mhm.
completely fine.
Yeah.
Like nobody has an issue with that.
That's right.
It's not even, we wouldn't even consider it some sort of hidden bribery or something like that. It's just like there are certain things that are acceptable in markets and there are certain things that are not acceptable in markets.
That's right.
It seems like this is just a way of taking something that should not be acceptable as a market and sort of hiding it as like
Mhm.
this exchange, like giving the wine.
Yeah.
Is that how you view it, or?
Yeah, although it kind of gets tricky because like, if I invite you over to my house for a dinner party and you bring a bottle of wine, first of all, I don't think people necessarily think too much about like how much is the dinner party going to cost and calibrate the, like if I say, come over to my house, we're going to have pasta, you bring $2 chuck. And then I say, come over to my house, I'm going to make lobster, you bring me like, 50-year-old Grand Cru, whatever, right? I think that you bring a $15, $20 bottle of wine to someone's house no matter what. So it's not like you're somehow paying for the groceries. And for that matter, if you come, just you're going to bring a bottle of wine. And if it's you plus one, you're still going to bring one bottle of wine. So there's a very loose reciprocity here. But more importantly, I don't think in any sense people are, and this is really just kind of an intuitive sense, but I don't think when you bring a bottle of wine, you're viewing it as I'm paying you back for the dinner. You're viewing it as you did something nice for me, I'm giving you a gesture of thanks somewhat as a placeholder until the next time I can have you over.
And it's relevant that both the food and the wine
They're commensal.
are going to be commensally.
Yeah, exactly. They're in the same circuit. It's not like, it would be weird if I invited you over to my house and you gave me an Amazon gift card, so how is it that I think, so I don't think that that's obfuscated. I mean, you could take an even more radical example of like, some economists have looked at marriage and said, like Richard Posner has one quote, I mean, he's technically not an economist, he's a lawyer, but he's acting like an economist. In his book, Sex and Reason, he has one passage where he explicitly says, there's no fundamental difference between marriage and prostitution, right? Which is kind of crazy, people don't really think like that. People don't really explicitly think it. Even like just below the level of cognition where they're not willing to admit it themselves, but it's kind of the elephant in the room. People don't actually think, okay, I'm getting this stream of sexual and domestic services and care work from my marital partner, and I'm giving up half my income, blah, blah, blah. People don't actually think like that in anything remotely resembling a conscious level. Whereas I think when people say, I'm going to go on sugardaddyforme.com, there is kind of it's a little bit close to the surface. Even if they would deny it to themselves, deny it to the judge, whatever, it's a little bit close to the surface of like, yeah, this is getting towards the realm of prostitution here. So maybe this could be changing to like get back to the institutionalization thing. Maybe something is so institutionalized, it's just taken for granted as legitimate. Right? So marriage is completely institutionalized, and we take it for granted that it's legitimate. And it doesn't occur to us to view it as basically a form of bundling that allows commensuration of pecuniary goods and sexuality, at least in our culture. Yeah.
I've been talking too much. But I want to propose that what you're talking about is a subset of constraints on the relational model in which you can transact things, and I put transact.
Yeah.
But there are things that certain kinds of things are coordinated in certain domains, and it's just wrong to coordinate them in another domain, in a given culture. And so it's not only about things that you can't buy and sell for money. There are things that you can't, so the baristas at my cafe, they kind of push the limits because they do give me a lot of coffee, but there's a limit to how much they can just say, oh, Alan, have some coffee because you're our friend, and we don't really want to charge you for that.
Yeah.
So they can't go the other way too far either, right? And I can't, although I try all the time, I can't tell my students who to vote for. So the authority relationship doesn't, it doesn't apply to certain things, right?
Yeah.
I'm not allowed, and they would laugh and not even believe that I was serious, or if they did, they'd take it to the dean. If I try to use the authority ranking relationship but I can tell them, this is what you gotta read.
Yeah.
These are the things on the exam, and they can't complain about that, but they can complain if I say, vote for these people because I'm the professor. So it's not only that there are rules in a culture about what you can't do in market pricing. There are rules for what you can't do in each of the kinds of relationships.
No, that's right. And I totally agree with that. That there's bounds on what applies to any given relationship. And at a more abstract level than what I'm calling an exchange obfuscation, you could view it as it's possible to bend the rules about what's permissible within a type of relationship in order to accomplish things that normally don't belong in that type of relationship.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So I think we're out of time, so I would like to invite you to come to a completely non-exchange-oriented lunch that I will purchase for you. I was trying to turn the interview.